everybody, so welcome back to In the Studio with Michelle McCune. We are going to be talking about value today. Value and contrast are one of the most important tools that an artist has in their arsenal when creating a piece of work. And it's most important to get these things figured out before you really start painting. So you need your subject, you need your design, and then you need to figure out your values. So a lot of times we do this with thumbnail sketches or what are called value studies, and they're very, very important to take the time to do these. It can really help you see your shapes and your overall lights and darks and how the patterns are working together and make any adjustments to help strengthen your design. So plain and simple, value is the range of light to dark. That's really it. So it's pretty much white to black and all the shades of gray in between. Your value patterns control the movement of the eye within a piece, and because of that, they're the number one design priority, which is why doing these value studies or sketches is so critical. Now, when we talk about a key, the key is your overall light or darkness of a piece of work. Is it more of a very, very light, airy piece, or is it something more dark and moody? So it is what is predominating, the lights or the darks in a piece. Now contrast we're going to talk about, which is the relative light and dark of two things next to each other. So the degree of contrast in a painting is going to determine how intense the light is portrayed. A very high contrast piece is one that you've got very dramatic lighting versus something that might be like an overcast day where everything's a little bit more muted. So contrast makes things visible, and very bold contrast is going to capture the eye. So we want the most contrast in the piece to be at our focal point because we want that to attract the viewer's eye. All right. So other factors that increase the visibility of light include the color family and light temperature. We're going to talk a little bit more about this later on when we're talking about color theory. But if you think about it this way, if you go out in the bright sun at high noon and you look around, colors are actually muted. Now if you go on an overcast or rainy day, greens are more vibrant and colors really appear more. So it's something to keep in mind when we're thinking about what our light source is and what the time of day is. All of that is going to affect the colors we choose, the temperatures of those colors, and how much contrast there is and how much differences there are in our values. We're going to talk a little bit about, okay, how do we figure out what values are? So we have a few tools that we're going to talk about, and one of which is simply a value key. So a value key has white to black and usually different numbers of grays in between. So they can be anywhere. Some value keys are only 9. This one actually is 11. And what I've actually done is I've poked holes in each number. So if I'm trying to compare values of something, then I can kind of hold it up and see, where is it most matching? Where is there the least contrast? So what is the value of that number? So like this paper is white. It's actually a bluer white than the white that's on this. So it's cooler, but it's still like a number one value. So when you're trying to learn values and trying to make sure that you have your values correct, this is a really invaluable tool. Now, when we talk about, I said like a high key painting is one that's mostly bright, a low key painting is mostly dark. We think of high key as things that are really uplifting or happy. Low key can be really gloomy or mysterious, maybe a little bit more dramatic. Going to show you just a couple examples of each. So that way you get a little bit more of an idea. So we have visited these before when we talked about composition and design. So this is a painting by my friend and mentor Guy Coombs, and this one is very light. The overall painting is light. We've got the drama contrast of the elephants, which pulls your eye right into where the elephants are. But overall, this is a very, very bright, you can feel the sun kind of day. This is a high key painting. Another example of a high key painting that uses a lot of light for drama. This obviously is cold, but you can still feel the sun. It's mostly the snow, the bright lights on the coyotes. So this is a piece by Dustin Van Wetchel that we talked about before, but another example of a high key painting. Now we're going to kind of jump to another painting of Dustin's, of some wolves. And in this painting, this one is a lot darker. So we've got the darker sky, we've got the dark rocks, but we've got the really high contrasty highlights that really create the drama. So this is a lower key painting. So this is a darker painting that's more low key. Along those same lines, we have a painting by Greg Beecham of wolves, and again, low key painting. It's a very dark painting, but by having all this darks, you can really dramatize the light, and there's a very, very strong effect when you've got this very bold contrast. So another low-key painting that makes a lot of drama. For Guy Coombs, this was another painting of his that in real life is absolutely spectacular. But again, it's very dark, it's very moody, it's very mysterious. It's an African Cape buffalo. In this big, I believe it's eucalyptus grove, or bamboo, I'm sorry. But anyways, again, low-key, very, very dark, lots and lots of drama. I've got a few of my own paintings I'm going to kind of show really quick to, again, just kind of get this concept kind of explained. So this one is called Surfs Up, very high key, little penguin. You can feel the sunlight. It's very, very bright. It's very cheery. He's just, coming out of the water. But because we've got all these lights, it makes great drama with the blacks on him and like the dark contrast with the shadow. This one, on the other hand, is a low-key painting. And it is, again, it's to create drama, but in a different way. I do call this one Hope, so I don't think of it as melancholy. But there is obviously a lot going on in terms of rhinos and poaching that does create a lot of concern and drama. But again, this is really about having a mostly dark painting and just using the lights to really create drama. Now, you don't have to have a high or low key. You can have a more mid-key painting. So this is more of a middle range painting. Lots and lots of grays, but because of it, these brighter highlights really kind of pop out and just kind of give you that little accent. We've talked a lot before about most, some, and a bit, and that really also applies to your value. So you want most of your value to be either high or low, or in this case mid, and then you're going to use the opposite ones for your accent. Okay, so if you are using a limited portion of the value scale for the overall painting, kind of like this one, so this again is a very narrow range, then you can interrupt it somewhere with a higher value, so that way you kind of get a little bit of a pop and create a little bit of attention. Okay, moving on. In order to control your values, you have to be able to see them, and this is probably one of the most critical things about value. All colors have value, but the colors can confuse you. So there are tools that we use to help us see our values and get them established at the start. One of which is the grayscale, and when you put the holes in it, it becomes a value finder. Another way, so where I got my grayscale from, which is one of my fun little tips and tools. So Richardson makes Gray Matters palette paper. And first of all, having a gray palette paper helps you see your colors better, because it's a neutral base, whereas if you use white palette paper, you will fight the white and you're not going to be able to read it as much. But when you lift the cover up, here it is. So this is the grayscale. I just cut it out and used a hole punch to punch holes in it. We're going to talk about color later, but he also has a nice little color wheel in here. That was from Stephen Quiller, who does one of the best books about guide to color and color theory. So again, when you buy your little palette paper, you get the added bonus of having a value key and also a little color wheel in there. So there's my little plug for Richardson's Gray Matters. If you don't have that, you can always create your own value finder with black and white. This is another thing that can really help, is just a little piece of cardboard that you poke holes in. This can help when you're looking for colors, so you can isolate something and you're not being confused. Like if you want to know, okay, what is this color? You can isolate it and you can see it better than when you've got everything around it confusing the eye. So simple little things like this can kind of help you judge your values. They can judge your color. So this is a very obviously inexpensive tool that you can use. You just need a hole punch. Other things that can really help when you're seeing values are to make a black and white copy. So we talked about this when we were talking about abstraction in the last class. So, we've got this, lovely photo of this pelican, and the best thing is to do a value study based on what you see, which is to sit down and sketch it out. But sometimes it's just hard when you're learning to try to figure out, what these different grays are, what these different values are. Sorry for the crinkly noise. So if you print it out in black and white, that takes away the confusion of the color. And then you can really compare your lights versus your darks, because value is all about stepping back and comparing what's light and what's dark. So black and white copy of your reference material can really help you in judging this. Learning to squint, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, is probably the most valuable tool you'll have. You could also use mirrors or even take a picture with a cell phone, and sometimes you'll see things that you didn't otherwise see. Now, when we talk about squinting, you're stepping back and you're closing your eyes, about 10 to 30%. When you do this, it helps you compare your values to one another in a very clear and uncomplicated way. So it helps you make sense of what can be very complicated, bewildering jumble of details and values in a subject, especially if you have a lot of bushes and shrubs and trees, which I think could be very difficult to see. So, the fundamental technical problem that a lot of people have, especially when they're starting and getting a painting right, is to be able to simplify and understand the relationships of the values to one another. So when you're learning how to squint, the trick is knowing what you're looking for. You want to know which values are the lightest lights, which values are the darkest darks, which values make up the average lights, and which values make up the average darks. So when you're first starting out, you just want to step back, you want to squint, and your main idea is you want to be able to break things up, simplify into light, mid, or dark values. You want to simplify the areas of light and shadow. So you can find something that's kind of in a middle gray to kind of use as your comparison point for consistency. And remember that our highest value contrast is going to be in the focal point, and then as we move away from the focal point, it's going to lessen, especially if we're going into the background. So I'm going to pull up our little pelican again and just say, okay, so if you step back and you just squint a little bit, everything's going to go a little bit darker, but you're going to have a few things jump out. Obviously, we've got our brightest brights are right in this area. This is our light area. The body is a lot more the mid-tone area, which then goes into the darks in the water. There's the dark shadow masses on the rock. We've got other mid-tone areas, but we're going to be constantly kind of squinting and comparing one versus the other. Our highest contrast is going to be right here with the eye. That's almost always the focal point when you're dealing with an animal. So we know that's where our highest contrast is going to be. Alrighty, moving on here. Important thing is to realize squinting is only about seeing the relationships between value and edge, which we're going to talk about next time. When you squint, things do get darker. So you have to open your eyes back up fully when you are judging the true values and the true colors. So squinting is to establish relationships, and that's critical here. So the limits, like we just said, colors darken, so you can't identify them properly if your eyes are squinted. Values darken, so you cannot identify them properly with your eyes squinted. So you need to open up your eyes and see the values are actually lighter than they looked like when you were squinting at it. Some other bits of caution: if you have a reference, or if you're out painting in plein air or in just out in nature, if you stare really long at something that's dark in shadow, you're going to start seeing more colors and more details than you really want to include. Reflected light is always going to look brighter because it's surrounded by shadow, so you have to make sure when you're looking at like light reflections that you're comparing it to your brighter lights to really see. It's all about stepping back and making comparisons. Photos lie, so that's one thing. I'm going to have a whole little talk just about the limits of photos. They tend to blow out our highlights and make them really bright and really white, or they can also darken the shadows by like 30%. So oftentimes, a lot of people when you're using photos will have multiple photos, sometimes even at different exposures, to get the information that they need. So that way, you don't have like a really bright section on the feathers on this bird. There's still details in here, and you don't want to just paint this entire thing as a white mass. You do need to have different values in here and different information in there to make it read like a cheek that's kind of popping out. So we use our values to create our three-dimensional illusion of contours. Okay, so in summary, we're going to go through a couple little value tips here. And again, remember, most, some, and a bit also applies to our values. We cannot duplicate the full range of nature's lights and darks because nature creates color and value with light itself. Okay, we are using pigments to create the reflection. We are creating the effect of light by seeking out and using the relationships between values and colors. And we establish these relationships by stepping back, and as we're painting multiple times, we're going to step back and compare our relationships. Step back often, squint and compare. Believe and accept the relationships that you see and don't doubt them. It's really important, again, that we paint what we see and not what our brain is trying to tell us. So remember, we're going to squint to see relationships between values and edges, but open our eyes to see the true values and colors. We want to be bold with our values and not be timid, but we want to make sure that we do have those values correct. Less is more, so we do need to resist the urge to overmodel, which is when you are using too many values to create form. You're going to have a stronger design structure by restricting the number of values in the major areas. We're going to constantly compare our values in the subject to one another and make judgments about which are the lightest and the darkest. We're going to use our darkest darks, our lightest lights as comparison and choose a nice mid-range. Remember, this is really important, the lightest shadow value area, so when you're in a shadow, the lightest part is always going to still be darker than the darkest part of a light area. So let me say that again. The lightest shadow value will always be darker than your darkest light. So when you have clouds, sunlit clouds, the shadow area of those clouds is still going to be brighter than the lightest part in a shadow on the ground. Okay, so your lightest shadow value will always be darker than your darkest light. We have to step back and compare. Watch highlights, they're rarely as bright as you think, and again, especially when you're working with photos. Dark accents are very effective and oftentimes are warm in color. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about color. And we mentioned this before, a general rule, you want 80% of your darks should connect. You can substitute color change for value change, which we're going to talk a little bit more when we talk about color. So just a couple more little things that I want to use for comparison. I'm just going to show you right now the painting that I'm working on. So I'm not really good with Photoshop, so if I move this back and forth, you're going to see it's a little shiny with Scotch tape. I basically cut and paste things. So this is a picture that I took of a bull moose in Yellowstone. And again, we need to work these things out to begin with. I liked the pose of this particular pose of this moose better than the one that I had that was in this environment. So I just cut the one moose out and I'm taping it on. So it's the same moose, but I just liked his pose better. Now, when I started looking at this and I'm starting to look at the values, and again, we always want to think about movement, and our darks and our values are what move the eye around. There's all of this brush in the front, which first of all is not that interesting. Secondly, it's a little off balance. We have this big blob of dark, and there's a little blob of dark and maybe a little bit here, but it just didn't feel really well balanced to me. It's not really moving the eye as well as I would like. So by looking at this ahead of time and evaluating my values, what I decided I was going to do with this, now this is just my value study on the painting, so when we start going into demos and how I paint, I'll explain this a little bit more. But so I have the moose in, and of course he's the darkest thing, but I decided, moose spend a lot of time in water, that I was going to actually put some water in, so I've got this dark that is now connecting to him, and there will be some shadow back here. Obviously it'll be a lot softer and less contrasty because it's way in the background. But this way we're going to actually have a little bit more of that S, that curve movement that makes the design a little bit more interesting. So I hope that helps you a little bit in trying to figure out what value means and what contrast means and ways that we can use it efficiently. And if you have any questions, always you know where to reach me. You can comment to this video, you can reach me on Facebook, you can email me. And next time we are going to talk about edge. Then we're going to talk about color theory. I'm going to do a little bit of a summary, and then I can start doing some demos. I really need to hear from you guys and what you want to see. So if you can like, share, comment, and let me know, that would be great. but I will be going over the things that I use, which are not what you have to use, but it's just what works for me, and my general process in painting. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.